Hi, I hope you're ready to have some fun, because we sure did when we interviewed Greg Lemoine from the International Teacher Podcast. What I love about working with Greg is when David found his podcast by searching for, international teacher type podcasts. And we started listening to it and we're enjoying it. And we reached out to see if Greg would be on our show. And his friends teased him. They said, "Oh, it's the competition." And Greg's response was, "No, this is a collaboration." And I love that about him and about what we're doing here. He's a great guy. And on this episode, we talk about his book, his podcast, how much we love making connections, and what a small world the world of international education really is. Greg joins us from somewhere in the Middle East. Greg is the single guy on the International Teacher Podcast, as well as the author of Finding the Right Fit, your professional guide for international educator recruiting fairs and amazing stories of a teacher living overseas. Greg's been teaching overseas for the past 22 years. When he isn't teaching, you'll find him scuba diving or working on his Saint Somewhere website or typing on his computer in a restaurant. This episode was recorded on October 20th, 2022. Please join us in welcoming the world-famous Greg Lemoine.
Hello, Greg, and welcome to the Educators Going Global podcast. As an international teaching man of mystery, are you able to give us an approximate location of your whereabouts?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Dave and Audrey. I am in the Middle East somewhere.
Excellent.
How about that?
So I've been listening to your podcast and having a good laugh along with you guys. One of the things you have a lot of is what we call going global stories. So how about sharing one with us?
Well, I figured the first story I'd share with you is basically when I first went overseas. I'll give you the short version of the story. I told my parents I was going to go to Honduras, and my mom said, "Oh my God, you're going to die." And my father, just in the same heartbeat, my father goes, "Oh, they've got great diving down there, like scuba diving." And that was in the same sentence. I was telling them all about my first job fair and the fact that I had no idea what was going to go on. And that was basically my going away as an adult, right? That was when it started.
Nice. And from your podcast, I know that you didn't really know what international teaching was, and you just kind of took that leap of faith. So that's really impressive.
Oh, it's a wonderful story. And I wrote a little bit about it in my book, and I could talk ad nauseum about it. But definitely my first job fair was the jump into the unknown like you would not believe. There was nothing out there, and I had no idea what I was doing. But here I am years later. It's fantastic.
Still doing it. Like I say, it gets in the blood.
And going the extra step that you have looked back at your career and you've written this wonderful book about finding the right fit. And I just want to share a little bit that when I started reading your book, you got me right at the start when you were talking about, as an elementary teacher, just the nature of the kids coming into your classroom and having their different jobs and feeling that agency and joy of being kids in your class. I just melted because I've been in the elementary as a counselor, as a wellness coach. My last post, that was such a great start. Speaking of stories, to your book. So let's jump right in about your book. So our guiding question is, what factors go into finding the right fit in terms of an international school?
I guess I could start off a little bit about explaining the cover and the title, right? And finding the right fit is the kind of phrase that they use at these job fairs. They meaning the recruiters, when they talk to you and they interview you and you come together and they want to know, do you fit as a person, not just your resume? Do you fit as a personality into their school? And that's the reason I called it Finding the Right Fit. And the reason I wrote it over the last 20 some years is because there was literally nothing out there. When I went to my first job fair, it was in Iowa, the UNI fair. University of Northern Iowa has a fair every year, and they've been doing it for, I think, almost 50 years now. And forgive me for not knowing exactly, but they have been around so long. And when I went to that job fair, I was looking all over the internet at the time and talking to people. Nobody knew anything about it. And here I was going to this job fair, and I had no information except for what they gave me after I signed the dotted line and paid all the money to get into the job fair. And at the time I was a student, so $150 just to throw into a job fair, was a lot of money just to get some information about it. So that's the gist of why my book was actually written. And it's to share, like your podcast, it's to share with people how to do what we do to become an international teacher.
The interesting thing to me is that there aren't more people who know about international teaching, like you guys call it the best kept secret. We've all called it that in one way or another. And I'm still a little mystified about why it's not more known. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that. My friends and family back in Green Bay, Wisconsin, when I first said I'm going overseas, they thought I was going to go teach English in a hut in Africa,
Right.
And
like me.
Yeah, exactly. Like you did at some point. And like I do on weekends in some countries, I go off and help kids that are in impoverished areas. But yeah, I think part of it is just that it's out of the comfort zone of a lot of people that are living in the States. I mean, to think I have so many friends that have never left the county, that have never left the city, that they think that going to Chicago is a huge endeavor. And a passport, I mean, what's that? How many Americans have passports? So if you look at the very basic part of that, and then add that onto a profession like teaching, where the schools that we have historically, our schools feed into a district, and the district high schools feed into a college, and the colleges feed into the school districts with their teachers, right? So you graduate from your teacher's college and you're feeding into their districts around that area, especially. So I was the only one out of 150 people in my graduating class of educators that year that was outside of the school district. And I had my job already in February, and I did mock interviews the night that I arrived. I had to go to some mock interviews for the district, where they had superintendents that come to the university and give us a chance to practice interviewing. And it was crazy because I had already gone through the whole process over a weekend with international schools.
Right.
And especially all the questions they can ask you at an interview are crazy compared to what they can ask you in an interview in the States with our laws and stuff, right? Like, Are you married and do you have debt, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I could go and talk to you many different ways about this.
They asked my husband and me, are you planning on having kids? Kind of thing. It's like slightly invasive.
Right. And totally off the wall for someone to ask you that in the States. So for me, going from an interview like that to going back to university, it's not on anybody's radar. So I still I feel like wearing a t-shirt when I go home where it's saying, with one paragraph, I don't teach in the sticks. I teach with American curriculum. I'm like a fourth grade teacher like you are, right? Down in Appleton or in Dallas or somewhere. I'm a fourth grade teacher like you are. I just happen to live overseas somewhere, and my students are vastly different, right?
Right. Yeah.
Hugely. So that's a great way to frame it. You're talking about a closed loop, kind of inward. And then when you go out to recruit, it's totally open. It's expansive in the different directions that you could go into. So they're almost polar opposite approaches to being an educator.
Going back to where you grow up in your city, to think that you're going to pick up everything and go to another country without even seeing that school, without even having an inkling of maybe where it is even on the map. So I've seen it on the map, but I'd say 99% of the people in my community back at home had no idea where Honduras was, right? So at that point, and I still have to explain what I do to almost every person that I meet. I have to explain myself. And the questions started building up over the years, right? Everybody's asked me the same questions. And what do you do? And how'd you get into it? And either they tune in and you end up having a really long conversation at a party that you didn't expect because they're really genuinely interested, or they just blow you off in 2 minutes and they start talking about their mortgage or the gas station that's missing down. That's the way it is to go back and return to the States or return home to my home country when I'm overseas teaching. So I guess the book just turned out to be a way of me giving back to all those questions that I've had over the years coming back from people in teaching. They never knew it existed. It's a secret.
Yeah. Well, good for you. And I guess, you were also, as you were talking about this closed loop, it seems that there's no real incentive for the universities to even inform their teachers that are in teacher college about this whole world out there because they want them to stay in the closed loop, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Because at my school, it's a totally different experience. And I've talked about this on another podcast, but we had the placement officer of our school thought that teaching internationally was fantastic. And he set up a fair. I went to Queen's University in Ontario. I don't know if you've ever heard of that fair, but
Oh, the Queen's Fair, of course.
yeah. And so it's been going for, 35 years or so. And so I was kind of introduced to it right from the beginning. And so it's difficult for me to wrap my head around the idea that in some places, in most universities, I guess, in the States, it's just not an idea that's introduced to teacher candidates.
So that brings up a good question I have for you. David, you've been reading my book a little bit, and it's aimed towards the big job fairs in the States, especially, and like ISS, International School Services, and Search Associates. But Queens is also one of those. And I didn't really talk a lot about it in the book, but my book was trying to encompass the step-by-step method that a lot of these job fairs are similar. So was I right in my thinking that Queens University, their International Job Fair for Teachers, is similar to the process at the ISS fairs and UNI and Search? Is it similar?
Yeah, it's hard for me to know how it is now, but at the time, and I haven't been to a fair in a while, but all the schools were in the gym, this huge gym around in a circle. And it was from Azerbaijan to Zambia, all the way around around on the walls. And they had their name of the school posted up and what job openings they had. And then they had their head of school or HR, or whoever, sitting at a little table, and you took a pink slip and signed your name and so on, and had a little chat with them. And there was a line of people behind you. And it was this whole very exciting, mysterious process. And then they also, as you've mentioned in your show, they had the head of school would do a presentation. So you'd go into the auditorium and they'd have slides and they'd talk about their package and they'd kind of pitch their school. So, that's very similar to the experience that I had when I went to UNI. So I'm imagining that it's a very similar setup.
Well, good. I'm glad that my book is on target, and I know they don't change that much without going to Queens. I've heard of it, and I do know that the superintendents and the HR personnel that represent the different schools and the principals, anybody that travels to the U.S. or is in the U.S. recruiting for the international schools, they tend to go on a circuit. So they will hit Queens, they'll hit ISS Fair, they'll hit UNI, and they'll pick and choose a couple. But since they come over to the stateside, I've talked to many of them that had been to Queens previously that weekend or the weekend before, and then they go to the next job fair. So it makes sense that there's a very similar methodology of how they do these fairs, at least so far.
Yeah, I'm sure that they look at each other's models and pick up tips from each other. But it's such an exciting experience, and it's anxiety provoking, but it's also super exciting to be able to interview with schools from all over the world. And I don't know how many, interviews you typically had, but I know one of the fairs my husband and I went to in Boston, we had like 16 interviews in one weekend. I mean, it blows your mind, really. Truly just so, and you're thinking, okay, I'm deciding my fate for the next couple of years. So you're right. It's really a leap of faith. And as you say, you've never been to the country, you've never been to the school. Now, nowadays it's a little better because you can at least get on the internet and see this thing, whereas we were looking at a book. So it was, there was an ISS book of schools and they just had description of their packages and stuff like that. So at least now, and also, for getting in touch with people, which we all recommend that you do. We kind of I wrote a letter to the French teacher that I was going to replace because I was teaching French in Ethiopia. And, he wrote back a letter and said, well, basically there's nothing here in terms of resources. Good luck.
Oh, wow.
It's a very different story, but it's still a big leap of faith.
Agreed. I don't know where to go with that. I have so many things to say. I think the book, the book that I wrote, the first half of Finding the Right Fit is specifically, and like David mentioned, I open up with a little bit of what life is like as a teacher in a specific school or some schools. And then I went right into a step-by-step process, exactly like you were talking about with the round robin, and it's over a weekend and things that you can really focus on. And then the second half of the book, I wanted to give it a little bit more meat and a little bit more size. So I included the exciting stories that I could think of off the top. A collection of stories of living in different countries and teaching. And they were not really teaching stories as much as living in those countries. And that's what I was trying to hit, because when you go to these job fairs, at least it used to be this way, and there's more books out now, but specifically about the tackling the whole roller coaster of emotion at one of these job fairs. Like you said, it's amazing because you're making a decision that's 2 years of your life, usually 2-year contract, in a place you've never been, and you have limited amount of information until you get there. So how to get through that job fair and succeed at one of those job fairs, there was a huge need for that. And that's why I ended up writing it. For myself, more than anybody, I wrote that book for myself.
So you carry it with you to the job fair.
Yeah, I think my mom read it too. So
yeah, thank goodness we have moms. So that leads perfectly into our next question, which is, do you have any stories to share about you or others finding the right fit and or not finding the right fit?
I have so many. I need to write a second follow-up book of stories. I love that question. I guess my first job fair was, I went into an interview once, and I won't say their names, but the school that interviewed me as a first-year teacher with no experience. I walked in and they looked at my CV, my resume, and they said, "You don't have any IB experience." And I looked at them and I said, "You're right. That's on my CV right there." And it ended everything. I mean, 20 minutes of just sort of talking at them and answering questions. I had no interest in this school whatsoever because they were unprepared and it just wasn't the right fit from the start. It was the wrong vibe, right?
Yeah.
And yet there was another one when I'll never forget, when I was at the job fair in, I believe it was Atlanta, and they have a mixer at night. Many of the fairs, they have a mixer in the evening, and which is a big social game, like who do I talk to, and people are watching. And I had just gotten myself a beer, and this man walks up to me and said, "Greg." And I was like, "Oh boy." He's like, "Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. Could I talk to you when you have a chance?" And he basically said, "Greg, you've got the job in Switzerland. I'd love to have you." And I said, "Are you serious? I mean, I'll drop my beer if you're serious." He's like, "That's okay. I'll buy you another one." Right. And it was that kind of humor for me means a lot. And I had researched them and interviewed with them briefly, and it was a great fit for the time that I spent at that school. I had a great time in Switzerland. The school itself was, and the lifestyle there was a really good fit for me. And the school I'm at right now, it's hard to have a story, but basically the last job fair I went to was in Atlanta, I think. And when I landed, there was a lot of mix up. I had signed up for 2 job fairs, and they got my paperwork mixed up. And the director looks at me and she goes, "What are you doing here?" Oh. And she knew me from a previous fair. She goes, "I didn't think you were going to show up. I thought you were going to UNI." And I said, "No, I'm here at ISS." She said, oh my God, we have to get your paperwork in order, and nobody knows you're here, and let me help you introduce you to some people." She goes, "What are you here for?" And I named the school, and she goes, "Oh, I know where they are. Let me go find them for you."
Wow.
So I had an interview that night after the panel discussion, and the wife of one of the recruiters was up on stage, and her husband was the director of the school, was right behind me in the audience, and he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Greg, hey, just hang out for a little bit after the panel discussion. We'll go up to the room together." And I was like, oh my God. And right after that, I had this hour and a half great discussion and recruiting and everything with them, and ended up getting the job before the fair even started.
Nice.
But then I stayed at the job fair for the next 4 days, just talking to new teachers and helping people through problems and finding the right fit for some of the schools I had taught at before. So those directors were at the school job fair, and I was matching them up for interviews with certain people. Yeah. So it was a great experience for me. I love the experience itself, right? The job fairs.
No doubt.
I don't know if that's too much of a story. There's too many stories.
Not at all. No. I love it. That's an excellent answer. And, I feel the same as you. It's the connections. It's thinking about all the possibilities. It's really an exciting time.
Yeah.
It's not about the interviews. It's about the whole experience of being there. You're on stage the minute you walk in there. There are people in the elevator, at breakfast. I mean, everyone you run into is a potential next boss or colleague or even in 5 years, they might be your boss and they'll remember you or not remember you
Yep.
according to what happened on that weekend. And you can learn so much about the whole world by going to their presentations and having a discussion at breakfast, whatever. I'm sure you guys feel the same way. Those job fairs are emotional roller coasters, but the whole experience is just bizarre.
It is. It's an out-of-body experience in a way. My husband and I had a similar experience where we got a job before the fair started, but he was teaching in the U.S. and we said, you know what? You already got the time off. Let's just go anyway. And we went, and it was just this amazing, networking thing where we met the head of the school we were going to go to. We signed the contracts right there. And then we had the weekend to just hang out with friends. And like you say, introduce people to heads of school, other schools that and it was awesome for us because all the anxiety was taken away right at the beginning, so we just could enjoy it. How about you, David? What's been your...
Well, you both are saying exactly the same experiences I've had, and we're all part of a helping profession. So on many occasions, I also, like the two of you, reached out to folks that looked a little bit nervous, not sure what was going on, and did a little attentive listening and then potentially guided them some avenues to follow. So this is a great segue as you're both offering some tips that are not just kind of linear ABC, but kind of the broad go in and have the full experience and how to do that. Greg, I think that was one of my big takeaways from the book was you're there. It's all about the experience. Find ways to network. And then your natural positive nature and just can-do attitude comes throughout. You just keep going forward. And there are going to be people there to support you, even though this is, like Audrey's saying, up to 16 or more interviews, and that can be a very difficult situation. But it also can be like, wow, we're on top of the world. We're making this happen. So jumping into your book a little bit more, what are some of your tips? And I preface this with just, folks, get the book. That's the bottom line here. Get the book. But if you could share a few of your tips on how to prepare once you're there. So what are some things that you would guide people to think about?
My first and foremost, and I've talked about this with so many people, and once again, these tips are born from the experience of not doing the right thing. I found a job my first year, but I think it was more like chance or pity. It wasn't because I knew how the job fair worked, right? But my first piece of advice is go stay at the job fair hotel. So if they've already announced it, in fact, for ISS, I'm going to go this year in February, and I already signed up for it. I already have the hotel. I have my plane flights. It's all set to go. No matter what, it's an investment. And for those of you that don't have any money, like I didn't have any money when I was a student and ready for my first job and starting interviewing and no experience, I borrowed and begged for money so I could say, I wish I could have stayed at the hotel, but I know about it. I didn't know I should have. But you have to beg, borrow, whatever you have to do, steal, to stay at the hotel over that weekend because you can experience the whole thing. And like I said, everywhere you go, there's some connection that's possible. So that's my first tried and true. The second piece of advice I have without even thinking is that based on hundreds and hundreds of other teacher experiences at these job fairs from people that have experienced these job fairs is don't just neglect the little country, the little school that you don't know anything about. And I think both of you could attest to this at least somehow with one school that you'd never dreamed of going to. I never dreamed of going to Honduras. I didn't know where it was. People were saying, no, don't go there. It's dangerous, yada, yada, yada. But I had a good connection with that school during the interviews as much as I could. And I chose to go to a place I never thought I would go. Some people, on the other hand, go in there with this idea that they're going to go to Europe and they're going to go stay in Greece because they think it's beautiful, or they're going to stay in Italy because they love Italian language. And yet there's a school in Fiji or a school in Russia or Uzbekistan that is just waiting for them to experience life and have a great teaching experience and rewards and trials and tribulations, all of that good, bad, and the ugly that goes into living somewhere else. And they will pass that up if they just write off those opportunities. Right? Those are my two biggest ones. Third one, maybe, I don't know. Just plan ahead, get my book because it really walks you through it step by step. And I appreciate you reading it and telling people to buy it. I would love to have it go out to every person before they go to a job fair because if they haven't heard about it, they don't know what they're missing. and they won't know about it until they get to a job fair.
Shameless self-promotion for the win. I love it.
I have to. There's only one
we
way
need Kent on here. www.amazon.com. Finding
Yeah,
the
that's
right
our
fit.
podcast. They make fun of me a lot. It's just I love it. Oh.
You do cover, the big, I was saying more the linear logistics, but just the insights, like you're sitting outside the door of the hotel room, and right there you're very clear from the beginning to say, guess what? You're going to go into the hotel room of the head of school or another administrator. So just get yourself ready for that. But you cover the nuances of sitting outside and just how do you handle knocking on the door and what happens if there's a delay, and potentially talking to the person right across the hall from you that's sitting there as well to break the ice and kind of ease the anxiety level. So there's so many different levels in the book that you offer advice for folks. So I can't picture, like you're saying, that the three of us all started recruiting just basically walking into these hotels. For me, it was Boston, and not knowing a thing. And now one can really map out what's going to happen. So that's just such a service that you're offering.
Yeah, I could have used that book too.
Oh, so could I.
30
that first
years ago.
time I'm sitting outside of this door and I'm sitting on this little chair and I lightly knock, and they had given us these instructions, right, at the panel before at that job fair at UNI. They have it right before you go to the interviews. They have a panel, and some of these things come up. Not much, but your brain is just on fire because you're like, did I get an invitation? Did somebody interested in me? And in the heat of the moment, it's hard, unless you know about it beforehand, to take all of the instructions in that they tell you when you get to the fair. If you don't have that in your brain already,
Right.
I'll never forget sitting outside that door of the first interview, and it's a hotel room. And I'm like, okay, they said knock. So I'm like, do I knock hard or do I knock softly, or do I just like scratch? I mean, I don't know. The door is like partially open, and is somebody in there? Am I going to interrupt? Am I going to just like get, kicked out of the whole thing because I interrupted somebody else's? Or are they're 3 minutes over?
Yeah.
Should I knock again?
Yeah.
These kinds of things are so nerve-wracking.
Absolutely.
And not to mention the fact that I had all my stuff with me in a gear, and I had a jacket, and I was wearing snow boots or something stupid like that. It's like, I didn't know how this worked.
Yeah.
So yes, I appreciate the fact that you agreed with the book, and it tries to hit you step by step,
Right.
so that you feel comfortable to focus on the main thing, which is interviewing and showing them your A game. And if you know some of these nuances and the little intricacies of what not to do and what to do and what to look out for at a job fair, then you can focus not on how the job fair works. You can focus on yourself and being your best interview ever, instead of worrying about, well, how do I do that next thing? And I didn't give myself enough time between interviews, and, I'm embarrassed or something like that, right? So that's the gist of that book, is prepare you to be your best interview ever and know all those things.
Absolutely. Like, take some of those unknowns off the table so that you can focus on what really is important. Absolutely.
There are so many more unknowns going on with you, and like where you want to go. What's the person going to say? What's my next question and answer? Are they still interested? Where's that country? Who's that person I just talked to? I can't remember.
Yeah.
They told me to talk to somebody. I didn't write it down. And if you can get yourself in control, like control the things that you can control at a job fair, then it's like preparing for an SAT test, right? You don't just take a test. You have to prepare how the test is given. Any standardized test, a lot of the battle is just figuring out the format of the test. And once you know what's expected,
being a good test taker.
Yes, same thing with this, because this is a test of your endurance and your sanity to go to one of these job fairs and put your experience on the line, right?
Yeah. Can you function at a high intellectual level and answer these questions cogently when your adrenaline is flowing and you're like, where was I and what time is it? And you're tired too. Often you may be jet lagged. Like, it's intense. It's awesome and it's terrible all at once, right?
Well, I'm hoping that when you buy the book and you read it, I'm hoping that you can walk into one of these job fairs cool as a cucumber and be your best interview possible, so that they're not worried about you. Because the people that do this all the time, that go on these interview routes, that go and recruit for their schools, these men and women have done it a lot most of the time. They're experienced and they see a lot of people frazzled. and they worry about the interviewers. They're like, are you okay? Do you need a glass of water before we start? And do you have any questions
Yeah.
about the job fair? And then they get into, once they know that you're settled and a little bit cooler, they can start asking you questions. But hopefully you read this book, take it with you to the job fair. And I can't wait to see a job fair this year and get feedback on the book, because that's what it's meant to do. I want to just spell it out for you, make you the best interviewer possible by knowing a format, right?
Do you know, I just had a crazy idea. I wonder if you reached out ahead of time and said, I could give a presentation at the beginning of this job fair for everyone.
Well, it's hard. You were joking before about self-promotion, right? And even on the podcast about promoting the book, or it's so difficult for me to toot my own horn. It was so difficult. I think if somebody else wrote to these job fairs and said, you need to have this guy at your job fair and promote it.
I'm doing that right after this. I'm going to do that.
I've reached out. I have connections and I have reached out a little bit, but you have to almost have, the idea has to come from somewhere else, and it has to almost come from them to me instead of me promoting it.
Fair enough.
Because I'm just some average Joe teacher, to tell you the truth. I'm just an elementary teacher. I happen to write a bunch of pages that my mom read, So we'll see after these job fairs what happens with the book. It's not even a moneymaker. It's more like a money pit. Right. So we'll see what happens with it. And I want it to reach out to people, and who knows what will happen in the future. Right.
Okay. Well, Kent will do it for you. Don't worry.
Oh, my gosh.
All right. So as a veteran, what do you think? Is the recruiting process very different from it might be for newbies, or in what ways?
That's a difficult question for me. I'll be honest with you. I found a right fit at this school. I've been here 7 years now. So what was it? 2015 was my last recruiting fair. And I've kept in touch with people, and I follow the information, and we went through COVID and everything. I'm interested to see what the face-to-face fairs happen, how they happen now, and how they've changed. I know that a lot of them have iFairs now, which are the video conferencing fairs that ISS has been doing it for years. And they still have the face-to-face this year, but I'm interested to see how it's going to change. So that's a question I don't have an answer for.
Have you been to an iFair then?
I tried one or two out before I found this job, and it was in its infancy for the ISS fairs. There was a lot of confusion because they were trying to work it out. COVID was not even a glimpse of any idea. Anybody back in 2015, nobody knew about it. But ISS had started their iFairs that year. It was the first year. I did a couple of webinars, and that was healthy and a lot of fun. But I didn't enjoy the iFair at that point. I think they've morphed a lot. So I haven't had a chance. I haven't needed to,
Right.
As we were saying before we went live, that we want to have you back on after you finish the recruiting season to just get your appraisal. Because our podcast is for the full range. It's for folks who are first timers to folks in the middle of their career, and then like Audrey and I, folks at towards their end who are either pivoting maybe to their last job or to retirement or to do something else. So that, I think that will be a fun podcast. We'll get you back on for sure.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Yes. Okay. We'll see what happens at the next job fair. I've got butterflies in my stomach just thinking about it now.
Wow. Wow. Well, speaking of podcast, we found you and your team, your buddies, doing your podcast. So could you give us a little background on how it started and kind of what is your intent with your podcast?
Well, I guess it started out about 2 years ago, and Kent is a fourth grade teacher, and he came up to me and said, Greg, you're in charge of our tech at school, and how do I do podcasting with my kids? And I looked at him like, I don't know. But it's an interesting question. So I think over the next couple of months, and I had some free time, and I inquired about it, learned about it, Googled it, YouTubed it, loved it, and fell in love with the technology of it. And I said, I think this is a great idea to do with students, Kent. So here's how it works. And Kent and I sort of let it go down the road. But at the same time, my friend Matt, the family guy, decided to say, hey, Greg, I think we should do a podcast about international teaching and share our stories and share what we know about international. And Matt and I had been in Venezuela together. So we always have these stories, right? So Matt and Stacy, his wife, and I, their son, and they had 4 kids now. And we hadn't seen each other for a while. We wanted to share stories. And Matt and I started doing the podcasting. I did all the tech stuff, and he was the host basically with the comedy. And we really feed off each other really well. And then Kent added in with the humor, and I love it. So we've been doing this since last year. I think we were on about episode 40, and the podcast came about for exactly the same reason the book did. And they both came out right around the same time, is that we really wanted to share our knowledge as veterans and give back to not only friends and family that want to know what we're doing, but also people interested in becoming teachers overseas and hearing stories of other teachers from different parts of the world. So I can never get enough of this. I could talk to you guys forever about your experiences, and we'll get you on the podcast, right?
Right.
So between the three of us, Matt and Kent and I, we have a lot of stories between us, but we also have this wide net of friends across the world at different schools that all have experiences. And the cool thing is that Matt is a family guy with a wife and 4 children that have been overseas for years. Kent has been with his wife, Carla. They have been overseas for years in different countries. And I am not married, so we have that perspective of married, single, and married without kids. So that was really cool. And we've also had TCKs. We've had the Third Culture kids on. And I have to plug, there's a couple podcasts that we've done with Julia. And Julia is a TCK from some of my friends in Singapore. And she started her own podcast. I believe it's called Crossing Oceans. And she's all about TCKs. So she has gone from our show and she sprouted her own show about TCKs, Third Culture Kids. And she interviews the friends that she grew up with living as a TCK. So I love the podcast because it's opening up a wider net of communication. I wouldn't have met you guys unless, you had heard the podcast, and I wouldn't have met a lot of other people until they came on and reached out to us or whatever. And it's also a good venue for the book. It's a good venue for the overall teaching. Right. So that's what our podcast is all about, right?
What's really fun, you talk about, like, one of the things that I absolutely love about this lifestyle is the huge network that you can develop. And right now I could go to so many different countries and I would know someone there and could reach out ahead of time and say, let's get together. And also the crossover, like when you interviewed Julia, I was like, oh my gosh, she was your student, I think, in Cairo. Is that right?
Well, her parents were my colleagues. And so Sue and Grant were my colleagues, and the girls grew up, and I went to their piano lessons, their recitals, and we did all these things together, right? So I've watched them grow up from afar.
So I worked with Grant, and Julia was in my class when she was in middle school in 7th grade. So I guess she wasn't actually in your class, but you knew her when she was a little younger. So, and then you reconnected in Switzerland. So that's just, to me, that those are the really joyful things about this lifestyle, is the connections.
Yeah, Dave's nodding his head like, yeah, that's exactly the same way I feel.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Well, David and I, we met in Saudi, 30 years ago, and we've stayed in touch all this time, and very, very cool stuff. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we sign off, Greg, about your book, your podcast, anything else you want to share?
I don't know. I just love this career so much. I think I tell people that it's the smallest school district in the world, but it's worldwide.
Right.
Because everybody knows everybody else. It's like peeling an onion. As you spend more time in this, your network grows. And it's just the tip of the iceberg when you first start teaching and you go to your first fair, or you meet somebody and they get you interested in the school and you go teach there. And it's amazing how it grows exponentially. So that's my final thought here, is it's just, I love this so much that I wanted to give it back with a book so other people can experience this. And I've come on your show because I want to share the love of what we do and communicate with other like-minded educators around the world. And the same thing with our podcast. If you have some time, listen to the International Teacher Podcast. It is a little bit more disorganized than this one is. You guys do a great job. I can't wait to hear more of your episodes when you finally publish and go broad with this. But I love it. I will push people towards your podcast too, because this is a great thing to share.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So how can people, they can follow you through the International Teacher Podcast and through your book about finding the right fit. Do you have any other contact information, whether social networking? I know that your podcast has an email. Do you want to share that or what?
Well, I've had to become more and more social. Believe it or not, we do have International Teacher Podcast at gmail.com. Very general. It feeds into my personal email so I can actually get a hold of them. I have a website called saintsomewhere.online, and that's on the cover of the book too. So I'm not bashful about that. So anybody who wants to know what it's like to live in Honduras or Cairo or Cambodia, you can go on to saintsomewhere.online and see videos of me skydiving or eating spiders. You can go on there and read newsletters. My family needs to know that I'm alive and doing okay and playing basketball or going bowling or something. And I did that for my parents years ago. Back in 2000, I started a website with newsletters every month instead of emailing. So anybody that's interested, it's been out there to the world for years. And that's why I put it on the cover of the book too, because I have nothing to hide. I have everything good to share. So yes, that website for myself, the ITP, the International Teacher Podcast, there's many ways to get in touch with us. And I'm on LinkedIn, I think, too, either Greg or Gregory Lemoine. So Facebook, I'm sure I'm on there somewhere, but I'm not bashful. I just don't know that off the top of my head.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to chat with us. It's been a lot of fun.
I can't wait to do it again. I love you guys for having a podcast like ours, and I appreciate you reaching out and asking me to be on the show.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David,
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.